Everyone. My name is Colin Richards. This is Leo Hall. We're the chief residents. And we just got done having a nice lunch with Dr. Kahook and really appreciate him spending time with us. Getting to know him has been great already, and sounds like we have a lot of great talks lined up for the afternoon. So Dr. Kahook is a professor of ophthalmology and the Slater Family Endowed Chair in Ophthalmology at the University of Colorado School of Medicine. He's the vice chair of translational research and serves as the chief of the glaucoma service and co-director of the glaucoma fellowship at the University of Colorado Eye Center. Dr. Kahook has authored over 400 peer-reviewed manuscripts, abstracts, and book chapters, and is the editor of Essentials of Glaucoma Surgery, MIGS, Advances in Glaucoma Surgery, and the free online wiki, keogt.com. and the seminal textbook of glaucoma, Chandler and Grant's Glaucoma. He was named the new inventor of the year for the University of Colorado in 2009 and the inventor of the year for 2010. Dr. Kahook has also received the American Glaucoma Society Innovator Award in 2020 and the AAO's Achievement Award in 2011, and the AAO Senior Achievement Award in 2017 and the AAO Ophthalmology Secretariat Award and the Ludwig von Salman Clinical Scientist Award from ARVO in 2013, and was ranked second in the 40 under 40 ophthalmology power list for 2015. He was named to the top 10 list of ophthalmologist power list in 2020. He's filed over 200 patents, with over 60 granted patents licensed by companies including New World Medical, Alcon, Aura Medical, Spyglass Pharma for development and commercialization. Several of his devices are currently in human trials or available globally for clinical use, including the Kahook Dual Blade from New World Medical and the Harmony Modular Intraocular Lens System from Claravista Medical, which was acquired by Alcon. Dr. Kahook is a member of Orbis International's Board of Directors and chairs of the Orbis Medical Advisory Committee. He's also an integral person in New World Medical and the philanthropic arm of the organization, Sidra Tree International. He's a consultant for the FDA's Ophthalmic Device Division. I really appreciate you coming all the way out here to talk with us and look forward to a great afternoon.
So we have 5 minutes left after the intro to go through my 3 talks, right? Thank you. I really appreciate the intro, and I really enjoyed the lunch with the residents. I was able to go over sort of a game plan for today, what to cover, and that can be changed. So if I'm starting to talk about a topic where you want less of it, just raise your hand, say less of it. And if you want more, we can do more. The way that I broke this down, as we were discussing during lunch, the first talk is more global ophthalmology from a glaucoma perspective. Then after that, the first talk's maybe 15, 20 minutes total. After that, I'll go into a little bit more about innovation. How do you think of an idea and then take it through commercialization? I'll talk about drug delivery and how that can tie into global ophthalmology. And then the last talk, if we get to it, depends on the time and how much we can get through. I'll talk about MIGS specifically on how to start doing MIGS, what are the tricks of the trade, and then how to pick which device for a specific specific presentation. So if any of that sounds more interesting, we can also spend more time on one versus the other. So this first talk is called Lasers, MIGS, and Tubes, What is Appropriate and What is Sustainable. I was asked to give a similar talk at Academy, and I did a little bit of research looking at what the science was behind much of what we do in global ophthalmology. And you might not be surprised to hear that there's not a lot of science around global ophthalmology, right? So what's our treatment algorithm and how do we think of things? So I'm going to go over that a little bit. These are my disclosures. You'll see the slide a few times. So, of course, I wanted to start off here just talking about David Patton and what he means to my world and what he means to a lot of what we're doing in global ophthalmology. So if you ever read a CV that is one of the best CVs you can read in ophthalmology, it's this one. So I encourage you to go in. He has his own Wikipedia page, so you can go in and also read about it. Born in 1930, and you can see from a pedigree standpoint, basically all the top institutions, he set his feet in there at one time or another. Also had multiple leadership roles in ophthalmology, including chairman, as well as some leadership roles that I wasn't aware of. And anybody who works with Orbis is aware of his name. But what I didn't know is that he was chairman of ABO. I didn't know that he was the first VP of the American Academy of Ophthalmology, and I took these slides from a talk that Brent gave. And countless awards, I think, is really just kind of downplaying what he's done. The way that this started, the way that Orbis started was a conversation, right? So they were talking about how can we make global ophthalmology better? And he had this idea of what if we actually got a plane and we were able to outfit this plane and go to where the plane was needed. Very unique idea at the time. You have some ideas that are similar, like the ships that actually go from one port to another. But this is the only plane that's doing this, and it's remained unique. The names on the bottom there are all those that were in the room, part of the discussion for forming Orbis in the early days. I do want to cover a couple of slides about Orbis in general. When you hear Orbis, just be honest, how many of you think airplane when you hear Orbis? Raise your hand. Pretty much everybody, right? But it's a lot more than that, and it has evolved a great deal since the airplane was introduced around 1982. If you look at the strengths here, the different things that are part of Orbis, you usually think of that first box, the treat and train, we improve the skills, go in and train, upskill local ophthalmologists, local eye care professionals. It's not just ophthalmologists, it's also technicians and nurses. But the bigger part that is now a focus is strengthening the healthcare system around eye care in different facilities. So you don't just go in and do one trip and then never go back. There's really a relationship that develops. And early on, the team at Orbis figured out that you have to do a lot of advocacy. So you have to talk to local and state governments in order to ingrain yourself into the healthcare system, and also from a reimbursement standpoint to make sure that the local ophthalmologists are getting paid so that they can maintain the care that they're giving. It's also CyberSight. How many of you have been to CyberSight? Be honest. So just one. So none of the residents have been to CyberSight. Do you guys know what CyberSight is? All right, I'm just going to spend the rest of the 3 hours on CyberSight. So CyberSight is, if you don't do anything else, I know I've said this a couple of times today, but if you don't do anything else after this visit, go to cybersight.org. And it has a wealth of educational materials, lectures, libraries of videos, surgical videos. There's a really good phaco course that just went up. So if you want to know the basics of, so you were on IC earlier today, so if you want to learn the basics of Orexis or Divide and Conquer, whatever it might be, you can go to the library. All of my YouTube stuff is on CyberSight, so thanks for visiting CyberSight. And you can also have access to an AI system. If you have a fundus photo, if you have an optic nerve head photo and you want to see what the cup to dis ratio is it glaucoma, is it likely to be glaucoma? Orbis has their own in-house AI team that you can access for free. So there's a lot, and you can also do consults. So if you're a global ophthalmology fellow and you don't have somebody to call if Brent's not answering your phone, you can go to the system and actually sign up and get multiple mentors to address any of your concerns. So there's a lot of stuff in Orbis other than the airplane, and I think that's a really important point. So go to cybersight.org. So I'll talk a little bit about what I do because I'm meeting a lot of you for the first time. I'm a glaucoma doctor. When you say that, usually half the room wants to leave, but I'll talk a lot about glaucoma, but hopefully the innovative side of it, not too much about trabs and tubes. I did my residency at the University of Colorado, went away for a year and joined as a fellow with Joel Schumann when he was at UPMC. Great year, really a formative year for me. And then 2006, we moved back to Colorado. I was appointed as chief of the service on my first day when I came back, and it's been a learning experience. It's still a learning experience. It's been 18 years. And I was the only glaucoma specialist when I started, and we have 9 glaucoma specialists right now. So it's a really big service. I spend a significant amount of my time, as you heard from the intro, with different companies, New World Medical, Spyglass. I'll talk about both of those. I'll mention a little bit about Claravista to give you an intro in my third talk, I believe. And then I spend a significant amount of time with Orbis. So I spend 100% of my time with each one of these. Orbis Board of Directors, Chair of the Medical Advisory Committee, and I do, again, a significant amount of work with CyberSight lectures. Synergy Foundation, which I would assume a lot of you haven't heard of, but it's another website that you should consider visiting if you do global ophthalmology or if you're interested in doing outreach. Synergy was set up as a philanthropic arm of New World Medical. New World is the company that makes the Unmet valve. And what we do is we initially started taking applications to fund different mission trips. But what we do now, especially during the pandemic, because travel wasn't allowed, we actually seek out who we want to give money to. So a certain percentage of all the profits from New World will go into Tree. There's a board within Tree, and then we make decisions as to where the money is. We still have incoming, and I still welcome that. But a lot of times we try to go deep with a couple of different institutions. Right now we're spending a lot of time in Guatemala with a training program that's in Guatemala. And we try to focus on a certain program and really go deep for a few years and then move on to another one. But that's another organization that I would encourage you to take a look at if you have interest in this arena. So let's talk a little bit about global ophthalmology as it relates to glaucoma. I think most of us know that glaucoma is a major cause of blindness worldwide. You might not be as familiar with the numbers. If you look at the numbers specifically 2020 and how it might grow to 2040, I think it becomes even more impactful. So there were 11 million bilaterally blind from glaucoma in 2020, and that was with a pool of around 80 million glaucoma patients. That number, 80 million, is going to rise to over 111 million in 2040. So you can see the burden of visual issues and blindness is just going to increase if we don't start addressing them a little bit differently. What I tried to do initially for this talk, as I mentioned earlier, is to find evidence-based medicine. So if I'm going into a specific country and I know what the burden of disease might be in that country, how should I address it with medication, laser, or surgery? And again, it really surprised me that there were maybe 5 to 10 papers max, and they were mostly opinion pieces, so not scientific research about what works the best. There were no specific recommendations, and specifically what I was looking for is the amount of training in the area, the actual location, urban versus rural, and what I can do to best maximize the interventions. And because I didn't find it, this talk represents my own experience, right? So it's not evidence-based, but hopefully we can get, if you're a resident and you're looking for research, this is a really good one to go into to figure out how to drive the decision-making with evidence-based medicine. General factors to consider: location. So several of you have been on different trips to do care, and I think you know right away if you're going into an urban area versus a rural area, it's very, very different. I'll go over this a little bit more in more detail in a subsequent slide. So what's needed? What's the disease burden? What type of glaucoma? Is it mostly angle closure? Is it open angle? Is there a lot of normal tension glaucoma? These are all questions that you should know before going to the place if at all possible. Probably most important is to know what your skill set is. So if you're a first-year resident, your skill set is you're going to help room patients, right? When you're going on these, you're not going to do any surgery. That's the wrong thing to be thinking about when you're going on a trip like this. What resources are available? Do you have access to microscopes? Do you have access to phaco machines? Do you have access to a microscope and a phaco machine in the same place, right? So oftentimes you might be operating, and Christos, I think, who's familiar to a lot of people, has a great picture of him with a microscope and the flashlight that's taped to the microscope because the microscope wasn't working, but he had a great phaco machine at the time. So what are the resources, and get to know that before you show up, because you have the potential of bringing some things with you if they need it. Sometimes they just need a light bulb, and they'll tell you that, and you can actually put it in your pocket, and you can operate with a microscope that wasn't working before. What can you take with you is really important. Different countries allow different things in, and the number of things that you're taking in is really important. So you might need a paper describing why you're bringing it in, that it's not commercial, that it's not for sale. So understand what you need to take and what the burden of taking that in might be. What can you leave behind? Is it sustainable? This is probably the biggest pet peeve that I have, where somebody might show up and do a bunch of Lensex cases, right? Femtosecond in the middle of nowhere, where they brought the machine with them and it was part of a study. And then that machine is never there again because it's just too expensive, right? Patients aren't going to be able to cover the docking system. So understand that, and understand what's sustainable and what you can leave behind. What's the cost of the intervention? Is it realistic to keep doing it? Are you going to do eye stents in Sierra Leone over and over again? Probably not. It's probably not going to be sustainable. Are you going to go back? So this question is super important, and hopefully the answer every time is yes. You should go to places where you will have a relationship where you can continue to go back. And then can you communicate afterwards? This is where WhatsApp really has been a savior. Several of us, I think, have WhatsApp groups that are active. I have a WhatsApp group for every country that I go to, and it's not just the attendings, it's also the residents. So if they have questions, they can send pictures, ask questions. it's really been, for me, very fulfilling to have access to the communication going back and forth. So I mentioned this earlier, urban versus rural. I think when you're going into different places, if you can think of it, this is a good construct to think of. There's a higher concentration of skilled surgeons in most urban areas around the world. Even in places where you think it might be underserved, low resource, you usually have several ophthalmologists in major city centers around the world. You're going to have access to more medications as part of an urban area in most places around the world. And you might have access to an OR with surgical microscopes. You're more likely to have that than if you're in a rural area, but there are still limitations. And those limitations include the lack of skills transfer. There's not a lot of give and take. There's not a lot of exchange of ideas with different surgeons visiting, either surgeons going into the country or coming out of the country. There's also limited access to new devices. Some of the things during lunch today, we were talking about IC8, we were talking about light adjustable lens. These are things that you're not going to find in most places around the world because the reimbursement structure and the patient pay structure is very different. Diagnosing is often a major barrier. This is where you find issues in urban areas where people show up, especially with glaucoma, very late in the process, and you're trying to sort of backpedal and see what you can do from a medication and surgery standpoint. On the rural side, the limitations are much more prevalent. Limited number of trained surgeons. In some places, no surgeons at all. You might be the only surgeon when you go into specific areas. Limited access to medications. Oftentimes, storing medications is impossible, so you're not going to have that available to you. So because of that, most of the solutions are surgical, and we can talk about what works better surgically in certain places. There's a high likelihood of presenting with end-stage disease. A lot of patients come in cupped out because there was nobody there to take care of them. They didn't really know what was going on at the time. So what is your skill set? And you have to be really honest with yourself when it comes to this. What's the skill set of those that are on the ground? This is probably the most difficult conversation that I have if I'm at Academy and I'm walking through the vendor area. I typically have 2 or 3 people come up to me, usually trainees, who say they want to get on the plane. That's the first thing that they say to me when they pull me aside, like, how do I get on the plane? And the first thing that I say is, you got to wait 5 years. Go out into practice, do as many phacos as you can, as many retina surgeries as you can, depending on your training, and then offer up your best. So I think I was honest with some of the residents that I'm not the best phaco trainer in the world. I don't have the nerves to be a great... How many of you are training phaco with residents in the room? So we got 1, yeah. It's a certain skill set that some people have that's great, and like Christos is really great at it. For me, I tend to be a little bit more of a nervous attending when it comes to phaco because I can't fix a lot of the problems that happen, whereas with a trab or a tube, I can pretty much fix anything that happens. So my best is to offer training for trabs, tubes, and I also do a significant amount of MIGS, so I'm happy training that. Teaching is best. So can you give that gift that keeps on giving? So I'm not there to do as many cases as possible. If you look up some of the videos that I have with Orbis, you'll see that I'm sitting on the assistant side as much as possible. I'll do maybe the first case and then train whoever wants to be trained to upskill them before I leave. It's not about me doing a volume of surgery. It's about being able to pass it on. And then I look for places of maximum impact. Tubes, very big need for doing tubes around the world. Most people don't have access to tubes. We'll talk about that. And then most people, of course, have never been trained on tubes, but it's really one of the best solutions that we have for glaucoma care because you don't have to have that extended care of a trabeculectomy. And also pediatric glaucoma, that's something that you can intervene very early on and make a big impact in people's lives. Should you have minimum amount of experience? I've already addressed this. So if you're a resident and you're thinking about doing this, or if you're a new a global ophthalmology fellow, how can you get some of that experience where you walk in and you feel like you can handle anything? It usually takes a little bit of time to do that. So you should go to a busy practice in Houston and do a lot of surgery and then go out and do as much as you can. Knowing what local clinicians can offer is extremely important. And this is one of the primary things that surgeons say when I ask them, well, let me take a step back. It's not very frequent for people who are visiting areas to call the surgeons that are there beforehand and say, what do you need, right? And it's like, it's the minimum thing that we can do, but for whatever reason, it doesn't happen. So you should talk to the local surgeons and you should talk about what their training has been, what training is available. What are the local stressors? So what do they actually need? What stresses them out? Is it economic? Is it something with government policy? Is it the lack of access to specific lenses? Do they want tubes? Do they want Unmet valves? These are things that you can find out before you get on the plane. And then, are they looking for a long-term partner? And is there a long-term partner for you so that when you leave, you can still have access to WhatsApp groups, teaching, and you know that you can go back and work with them? These are all extremely important things. Okay, so what are the options? Let me ask the residents. So if you're going to Sierra Leone, you smiled, so I'm asking you first. You said you're doing retina, right? Yeah. Perfect, right? So you're going to Sierra Leone. You're in a small village, and you know that there are a ton of glaucoma patients. What do you want to do? How are you going to treat those patients? There's not a single bottle of Timolol anywhere in the whole country.
So it'd be nice to know, like you said, the demographic of glaucoma, assuming that it's predominantly open-angle glaucoma in Sierra Leone, then I think some decent solutions would be cataract surgery. You could also do, combined with that, some MIGS procedures, and then depending on the severity, probably a tube would be one of the things that you reach for. Those would be, I think, the ones that would have lower input on the front end. So instead of getting like, a trap set up and then trying to have follow-up for that.
So that's the most you're going to talk about glaucoma for the next 2 years, right? You're going to cause a bunch of it. But so what you just said was perfect, right? Does anybody want to disagree after I just said it was perfect? Resident-wise, anything that you would do? Why not SLT? Why not just go in with an SLT machine and go at it? So we got one head shaking, but I don't know who you are, so I don't know if I should call on you or not.
I'm a resident from Temple.
Okay.
I don't think SLT is very useful because it wears off. It doesn't necessarily work on some people. Then also the severity that SLT addresses might not be that of a rural village in Sierra Leone.
Yeah, those are all great points, and I'll get to that in a little bit, so hold on to that thought. So one thing to think about is sustainability, and that is the point that we're just kind of sort of skirting around a little bit. If you're thinking about using an implant, in most cases, it's too expensive. So you might bring a bunch of implants with you, but after those are gone, most of the time they can't afford replenishing the implants. So I would say 90% of the time, answering with the answer implant is not going to be sustainable. Lasers, CPC, SLT, ALT. In a perfect world, I would always have a CPC with me wherever I go. I'd be able to leave it behind, and I'd have enough probes to last forever, right? That, of course, doesn't happen. But in many cases, CPC, if you think about it, in a perfect world, CPC would be a great solution because of the follow-up being a lot easier, and it addresses a lot of different types of glaucoma. But the answer about SLT, the one thing you didn't mention is that most of the places that you go will not have engineers to fix the machines. So even if you left the SLT behind, ALT or CPC behind, inevitably it's going to break down because it always breaks down. You have a lack of engineers, a lack of know-how, and that's one of the reasons why Orbis actually has a course around engineering and fixing lasers. Greg Spooner, who's a laser expert, is part of the medical advisory committee. He created this great course, and it might be helpful for some people at Wills to take a look at it. Upkeep cost is a significant issue because it's a recurring cost for maintaining the devices. And then disposables like the G probes are extremely expensive, right? So in the US, even though it's multi-use, most of the G probes are going to be around $1,200. So you can imagine, even if you're using that 30 times, it's going to be, which, that's debatable. We can talk about reuse. But it's going to be an issue over time to afford that. When it comes to antifibrotics, mitomycin, this is one thing that surprised me when I started taking some of these trips. Mitomycin is not available in most areas. When I was in training, I thought it was going to be available everywhere. It's very inexpensive, but most places actually don't have mitomycin and never have used mitomycin for their trabs. And then this last point is something you should always keep with you. In my book, doing outreach is not the place to do research. So there are some places that you can go that are set up to do research that's really good for the community. They're going to get access to care that they wouldn't get access to in other circumstances. But you shouldn't do regular teaching, medical service outreach type trips where your primary reason for doing it is you're part of a company and you want to get as many cases as possible. That's a recipe for disaster. This is something that happened in Guatemala a few decades ago, and they shut down the whole country for teaching trips, so nobody was allowed in. The University of Colorado has a deep relationship with Guatemala, and it took a long time to get people back in because the government was suspicious of anybody that wanted to come in and deliver care. So keep that in mind. It's really about helping, not about doing company work. So cataract surgery alone is the first thing that you mentioned. I would do cataract surgery. What's the problem? Who wants to impress me? What's the problem with doing cataract surgery as the treatment of choice for glaucoma if you're going to Ethiopia, let's say? You should answer that because you answered phaco. What's the downside to doing that? This is Hydrus data. A lot of you are familiar with Hydrus, but as I understand, not a lot of them are used here. But Hydrus data shows you that phaco works really well for pressure lowering, right? And it's almost as good as Hydrus, right? And if you look at the iStent data, there's only 1 millimeter of mercury between phaco and iStent. So why not just do phaco on everybody? What's the reason not to do it? You guys wanted interactive, so here's interactive for it. Anybody in the room, so it doesn't just have to be a resident. Why don't you just want to go in and do, I always say this to trainees, that phaco is probably the best glaucoma intervention that we can do, except it's random, right? Who it's actually going to help. So if you look at data that are not post-washout, so in all of these studies that you see, Glaukos, Ivantis, even KDB stuff that you see, a lot of the patients have been washed out of their medications and they have a pressure of 24 to 36 roughly. And you do phaco on those patients, inevitably a big chunk of them are going to come down. But if you're looking at real world data, somebody who's on one medication comes in with a pressure of, let's say, 23, 24, and you do phaco on that patient, you're going to have a subset of those patients, maybe 30, 35%, who are going to have pressure lowering. You're going to have a subset that are going to have no change in their pressure. And then you're going to have a significant subset of patients who actually have an elevation in their pressure. If you're just taking real-world data, and Dick Lindstrom did these studies along with Tom Samuelson and others that showed real-world data, you have a significant number of patients who have an elevation in their pressure. So if you're just going in and you're doing this, you're going to have a significant chunk of the patients who don't change at all or who have an elevation in their pressure, and it's not really a good intervention to do as a standalone. We've made a big deal out of it because of the MIGS studies, but in the real world, it doesn't behave this way. There are also a lot of issues with follow-up. So this is one of the studies that I found looking at how patients in different parts of the world respond post-trabeculectomy and what are some of the downsides. This is a study that was done in southern China looking at TRABs, 212 patients. And the thing that stuck out to me is that follow-up at 1 month was under 30%. So the majority of patients who had a TRAB didn't follow up after 30 days, which is insane, right, when you think of that. And the reasons are outlined here, and these were also surprising to me. So patient predictors of poor follow-up, education level, belief that follow-up was not important, so there was poor communication, which happens frequently on medical service trips. Lack of accompanying family, if they didn't have somebody with them that encouraged them to come back. Annual income, and then not requiring removal of scleral flap sutures postoperatively. So when you do something and they think you cured the glaucoma, patients have a tendency, if they haven't been educated, they have a tendency to not come back. Factors unrelated to poor follow-up, age and sex, employment status, travel distance, which is probably the most surprising to me because I've read a lot about travel distance being an issue and hardship in travel. Clinical factors, so the subtleties of their presentation, and then physician factors. So we looked at communication in other studies that we've done, and we found that it was actually very relevant how much the physician communicated. But in this study, they did not find this as a major factor. So here are my choices. I'm going to finish up with a few summary points here, and then I'll open up for questions if we have some time here before we jump into the next talk. So cataract surgery, I think, is a great option, but it should be teamed up with something in the angle while you're in there. And we talked during lunch that there really is no excuse to go in and do some of these things and not do what's standard of care in the US as much as possible. So right now in the US, if you have a glaucoma patient with elevated pressure and they're on 1 or 2 medications, I would argue that it's standard of care to do something in the angle. Right? You can do whatever you want. There are multiple options, but I think you have to do something at this point. unless there's a reason not to from a medical standpoint. Trabeculectomy is something that is really easy to do in a resource-depleted area or a resource-challenged area. If you're aiming for lower IOP, great option, but it has a huge failure rate, and especially if you're not using mitomycin. The majority of these patients fail. You go back after 6 months, they're all needing something else, and now you've taken a quadrant of their conjunctiva, and it's really hard to put a tube in that area. So keep that in mind. Often the only choice available, unfortunately, and there are some places that I go where we don't have access to tubes for whatever reason, and we're still doing trabs. One thing that we've done, we mentioned this again during lunch. Everybody should have been on lunch. We had a lot of conversation at lunch, apparently. Right now, if you go to the New World Medical website, there's a tab on there for humanitarian devices, and they will send you ClearPaths or AGVs if you're going anywhere if you just fill out the form. So this trabeculectomy slide should probably change pretty soon, because you should have access to tubes wherever you go, and you don't have to do a trabeculectomy. My wish list, really, these two things would be ideal, right? I would always have a glaucoma drainage device available. AGV, the Unmet valve, is likely the best solution rather than a non-valve device that you have to tie and watch over time, just because it's going to give you more reproducible results. Now, there's more hypertensive phase, and there are ways that you can train the local staff on how to handle that. You overcome a lot of the disadvantages for trabs that I think are pretty obvious. It's going to be more reproducible, and you're not going to have hypotony issues as much as you would with the trabeculectomy. Partners with on-the-ground eye care professionals. So you want to make sure that there's somebody there that can do the follow-up, and also to train and send supply after you've trained them. So there's a system within New World to make sure that a lot of facilities around the world can get things at cost, right? You still want some sort of cost barrier. We could talk about that a little bit later, why that is. But there's a system, you want a system where the resources can continue to be replenished. Trabeculectomy is a distant second for all the reasons that I mentioned. And I'll go back to CPC. So if I had a backpack and I could put one thing in the backpack to go treat a community full of glaucoma, I would pick CPC. And we have to find a way to get the probes at a less expensive cost, a more reproducible way for doing this for different communities. But again, CPC have done low and slow. If you guys haven't rotated with Joel, you're going to hear this a lot, the low and slow part. So go very low on the energy and longer on the time. You can treat a lot of glaucoma primarily with CPC and not have to worry about a lot of the complications that come with filtration procedures. We have not talked about diagnostics, and this is a lecture within itself that I'm not going to cover today, but it's one of the bigger needs globally, that we have to diagnose glaucoma earlier. Could we use different cameras? Could we use telemedicine? Can we use AI? All of these things are just now growing up. We heard about OpenAI, ChatGPT came out, everybody's kind of going crazy over AI, but I can tell you from a medical standpoint, it really hasn't changed on the ground activities at this point. I mentioned that there's AI on CyberSight, and I think it's something that a lot of you can go check out, and you can, if you have an optic nerve head photo, you can load it in and sort of see how it works. But the barrier in most communities outside of the US is that they don't have a proper camera to get that photo that they can then upload to AI. So the barrier comes, the funnel is actually stopped way beyond when you can use AI. So this is an area, again, for residents who are looking for research areas, very big area that can be improved upon for global outreach. Partner with companies. One of the best things about ophthalmology is almost every company, with a couple of exceptions maybe, are always willing to give you devices, usually for free. And they do it, and they're excited about doing it, right? It's one of those things where companies might be competitive. I've been in situations where I've been on trips where Glaukos, iStents, KDBs, Hydruses have all been furnished for free, right? And you're excited about that. The companies are excited, and of course you have to think about sustainability. Is that going to be something that they can continue doing after leaving? But the beauty part of this is usually the questions are minimal. They just want to help, and I think that's one of the great things about being in ophthalmology. We're surrounded by a community of industry members who really want to help. And of course, we have a lot of ophthalmologists who really want to help. So I'm going to finish with this slide and just talk a little bit about some summary points and maybe introducing a couple of things to think about. Medical outreach is not exclusive to international locations. So this is something that we don't talk about a lot in global ophthalmology. Have you guys heard of the term glocal? I don't know if you talk about that here, but So it's something that's discussed a lot in Denver, that you take the global part and you apply it to the local, because we've done a lot of stuff with global international work. And then you walk down the street. So the main street in Colorado is called Colfax. We're just off of Colfax as an eye institute. So if I walk out the door and I walk in to Colfax and I make a right, head towards the mountains, I can run into about 100 people who need eye care who don't have access to our facility for whatever reason, right? These barriers exist. We have outreach clinics in Denver that are usually empty, and I don't know why that is. So we're trying to get patients in, but we can do a much better job, and you don't have to get on a plane to go somewhere to do this. I'm sure you have exactly the same thing going on in Philly and multiple other cities around the country. Customize your approach to each situation. We talked about urban versus rural. Skills transfer is the most sustainable route. So don't just go in and do a bunch of surgery. We all know that this happens sometimes, where you go in and you want to learn M6. You want to do as much phaco as possible. Usually what happens when you do that is you're going into a place that has a phaco surgeon, and you're just taking all the phaco away from that surgeon, and their practice is no longer sustainable. So this isn't, again, something that we talk about a lot, but there are places in Mexico that maybe you've been to where surgeons come in and they do 50 phacos, and patients who are able to pay are going in for the free surgery. And the ophthalmologists who are local, who were taking care of those patients, get very upset, as you can imagine, because they are trying to maintain their practice. So I think it's really important to have the skills transfer. I think it's really important to bring product into a place, but really be familiar with the ecosystem and where do you need to go, and don't go for the volume, go for the teaching. Connect with an existing group, talk to the ophthalmologist locally if they're around, or to healthcare professionals when they're around, because they're gonna tell you stuff that you probably never would have imagined. Maintain the connection with local resources, and this is where WhatsApp really comes in. Like I said, I have several WhatsApp country groups that I communicate with. I learn just as much as I'm teaching, and I think it's really helpful to make sure that that connection stays active. And then this last point kind of leads into my subsequent talks. Can we innovate better solutions so that we have better, more cost-effective ways for low resource depleted areas to access the same level of care that we're getting in the United States? So I'm going to touch on that, but I'll stop here and see if you guys have any questions about this part. So any questions?
Can you talk a little bit about transporting the equipment when you may not have a plane available, and when you're bringing things on site, what you're bringing, what's being left behind, and to the point about upkeep, etc. How you go about educating people and ensuring that those systems can remain in place if you are leaving them?
Yeah, so really difficult question to answer, because it kind of depends on where you're going and what you're taking, right? From a transport, I'll tell you some of the most exciting, in a bad way, the exciting times that I've had is when I've been stopped and somebody's kind of going through my bag and they see, 10 IOLs that are sitting in a bag, and they've never heard of what an IOL is. And I've already declared that I'm there, for visiting friends or, teaching, but it looks like I'm a vendor of some sort, right? So I've learned the hard way that no matter what I'm taking in, I always have documentation from whatever organization that I'm working with that this is what it's used for. That's my primary worry when I'm taking things into a country. As far as storage and all of that, you can take care of all of those things pretty easily. And if you can't yourself, then you're using some sort of an organization to bring it in. So Orbis takes care of all of that. Very convenient. A lot of you have heard of C International. One of the biggest skill sets that C International has is that they have warehouses around the world. They actually have areas that they can ship out of that doesn't have to come from the US, so it can be much more convenient. They do a really good job at logistics. So there are different things to consider. Medications, extremely hard, right? Because a lot of times they're held in, at the port when they're delivered, and it takes a long time to get them out. It's really hot. They're not taking care of refrigeration, and that's why we don't really use medication transport a great deal with what we're doing. From a device standpoint, though, it's pretty straightforward. You can FedEx something as long as you do the proper documentation to most places around the world. I don't want to just say FedEx because of the Orbis connection. You can UPS anywhere else, and it's usually pretty convenient. So luckily, the only issue you should think of is if you're trying to do it, and sometimes you have to, just have the appropriate documentation when you're doing it. Any other questions? Yep.
I wanted to get your feedback on SLT. You brought it up briefly, but the use of SLT in low resource settings, because it has its limitations that I think were very astutely mentioned. But one of the positives of it is that it's something which is more easily treatable, especially with direct SLT now being more widely available, and something that could be a non-surgical intervention option that could be left in sight and be used on a repetitive basis.
Yeah. So everything you said, I agree with, except the biomedical engineering part, right? So if you're introducing an SLT or DSLT, right, when it's available, if you look at the LIGHT study, right, so great efficacy, especially as primary therapy, but inevitably in a couple of years it's going to fail. Not the device, but the treatment itself is going to fail. And then the device itself fails and you can't do repeat treatments. That's usually what I'm thinking about. There's a DLT machine that is, I believe, off the market right now that would attach to the slit lamp. And that was very convenient because you could actually trade that out. The cost of goods were not that expensive. There's a company called Norlace that some of you might be familiar with, laser company, and they're doing some of that as well. I think if we had access to devices where the cost of goods was less, then I'd be much more likely to advocate for SLT. Direct DSLT is a different story, right? So we can talk, the efficacy isn't the same as SLT, and I'm not sure about the safety profile at this point. I need to learn a lot more. I'm not saying anything bad about the company, I just don't know enough from the information that we have today. So laser is an amazing option if it weren't for those limitations that I just mentioned. I would just use laser, not just CPC, but SLT with everybody, right? So if you look at some of the studies that were done in St. Lucia with Tony Riolini, and before that, Roy Wilson, decades ago, going into St. Lucia and basically curing glaucoma, right? Everybody that was treated did really well for multiple years, but the SLT machines that were left on the island don't work anymore. There's nobody there to operate them. And of course, you continue to have new cases of glaucoma. So it's not the best solution, but it might be the only solution in some places. Any other questions? Who wants to hear about drug delivery? Raise your hand. Yeah, just one person. Yeah, we're still going to talk about it. All right, so think about sustained drug delivery in the context of global outreach and how nice it might be to be able to go in and give therapy for multiple years just with a drug delivery device. So I'm going to go over this talk and then we'll take a break for a little bit and you can grab something to drink and then we'll hop into the third talk after that. Same disclosures. I gave a similar talk a couple of years ago, and this is a talk that builds on some of the technology that we're doing at the University of Colorado. I'll talk about current realities of adherence or lack of adherence to prescribed therapeutics. I'll talk about the pros and cons of different drug delivery approaches that are either on the market or coming to the market. And then I'll cover two specific technologies that came out of our device lab, one that goes through the lacrimal system and one that's implanted in the capsular bag. And then I'll have some closing thoughts about how this might influence your thinking about the future of eye care. All of you have heard of ChatGPT. This was all the rage when I was starting on this talk. So I went into ChatGPT and I put in the transcript to some of the slides that you're going to see after this one. And I said, just give me a summary, right? What's the unmet need for drug delivery? And ChatGPT came back and said, we currently lack pharmaceutical methods for treating ocular diseases with precision and efficacy, where drugs are delivered directly to the targeted tissues and where patients experience fewer side effects. And it was full stop. And then I added without compromises, because there are significant compromises to the current drug delivery methods that we're using. If you just look at medication bottles, which is the primary therapy that we're using, even after the LIGHT study, right? We're still using drops as the primary therapy for most glaucoma patients. Cost is a huge issue. Physical limitations, a lot of our patients are elderly and just can't aim the drop on the eye itself. Adverse events like redness, stinging, visual issues that make the patient say, I'm not going to use those drops. Inconvenient. Anybody who's ever been on a short-term prescription, you know that at the end of that, you look in the bottle and there's still a couple left. So even, younger people who are doing things for acute reasons can't take all of their pills. Certainly the same thing with drops. There's also a lack of understanding. It's not like macular degeneration where you're losing your central vision. I think most of you know this. With the peripheral vision loss, it's hard to explain to the patient why they're doing something that makes them feel worse. They can't see as well, and it's also very costly. Adherence to glaucoma in particular, out of all medical problems that are chronic, is very poor for those reasons, that they don't notice that something is going on. Non-adherence can lead to complications that are real. It used to be that we didn't have science around this, but now we do, that non-adherence leads to greater visual field deficits. And I think this is a real issue that we need to overcome. This was the treatment algorithm when I was in training, and in some places in the US, it's still the treatment algorithm, and in most places around the world, it's still the treatment algorithm, where you start off with medications for mild disease, you go on to SLT or ALT when the medications don't work as much as they used to, and then you go on to filtration surgery, tubes, and then usually for end-stage CBC. It was based on the stage of disease or what they didn't respond to, and that's how you moved on to the next therapy. With the introduction of MIGS, a lot of that has changed. We have a lot of surgeons who are comprehensive, who are doing glaucoma therapy, and we can access the MIGS devices for mild all the way to severe, right? You can be severe glaucoma, pressure of 24 on 2 meds. You can still get a goniotomy and drop to the mid-teens and do really well for a long period of time. So you don't have to just say MIGS is mild to moderate. We're using it across the continuum. And our choices are based on really tailoring the therapy, right? Age, pressure, visual field status, all of the things that we kind of wished for when I was a fellow, that we could tailor the therapy. Unfortunately, most advances have been surgical, despite the existence of really good medications. Our PGAs are very, very effective. It's just that patients, for the most part, are not using them. And despite new approaches that are surgical, what percentage of cataract surgeons would you guess are actually doing MIGS for the residents? Just take a guess. Even the fellow can answer, right?
30.
They're debating here. That's like, what is it?
It's either
30.
28 or 30.
What do you do?
I'm a senior resident.
Okay. And then what did you debate? What did you come?
You said 28 to 30.
How did you guys, like, this is like very accurate, right? So, and we didn't know this, so we actually had to go look it up, and we looked at Medicare data, and then we cross-referenced it with other data sets that we had, and it's 25%. So you guys were really close. 25% of cataract surgeons are doing MIGS, 75% are not. Does that surprise you? It's like, so it surprised me. I thought more comprehensive cataract surgeons were doing MIGS. And so if you have all of these fancy angle surgeries and nobody's doing them, that's not really a great solution for the majority of our patients. So you have to give surgeons something that they're going to use, is the message there. So adherence to medical therapy, how did we get to where we are today? I'm going to cover this topic, which I started actually when I was training, when I was a fellow with Joel. I remember having this conversation with him in the hallway about a patient. There's a patient who worked at the university that I asked questions about her drops, very educated, and she couldn't answer the majority of the questions that I was asking her. So I went out and I was like, I don't think she's actually using her drop. And that led to research where I started looking at papers that covered adherence. One of the first papers to cover this was Dr. Spaeth. So you guys might be familiar with some of this literature, where he looked at the different barriers, and some of these are on this list. I did a review article where I covered his paper and other papers, and this was the list that we came up with. The one that surprised me, and I wanted to take a deeper dive into, is this inability to identify the correct bottle. So if you're in your clinic and you're trying to get from the patient what they're using, what do you usually say? If they don't know the name, what do you say? What's the cap color, right? And the cap color is something that's unique to the US. That's not something that exists outside of the US, but we have what I thought was this privilege of knowing if it's a yellow top, it's a beta blocker. But then a patient came in and she said she was on a teal cap color. What would you say that is? Right, it was actually pilocarpine. And I thought, well, wait a second, are we actually communicating the right way? I ask every patient that comes in to see me to bring their drops in every time they come in. They have to bring their drops, and not everybody listens. But when they do, it's surprising. You guys know Nate Radcliffe, glaucoma guy from New York. So he has great pictures of patients who bring in their caps, their bottles, and the cap has the markings of dog teeth on it, right? So there's strange things happen to drops, so it's good to have patients bring them in. So I started taking a deep dive into bottle cap color and started finding out some pretty interesting things. So Catherine Mirando, who was a med student at the time, she's now a glaucoma specialist, did a study in our clinic where 126 patients left my clinic, and she sat down with them and went through a questionnaire. We started off with a very simple question. How do you identify, if you're on more than one bottle, how do you identify which bottle to take at a specific time? The number one answer is, as we would imagine, cap color. That's how I identify the two different bottles. Bottle size and shape was the other one. Flat bottle traditionally before generics was latanoprost, and that's how some patients identified. And you can see some of the other ways that drops are identified. We took it one step further, and we partnered with Pradeep Ramulu from Hopkins, and we wanted to ask the question slightly differently, right? So we got different caps, took pictures of them, and put 11 different caps on a piece of paper, and asked the patients, what color is this? And out of those 11 colors, we got 102 unique different descriptors of those colors. All right, think about that. And if you just look at latanoprost, the majority of the time when the doctors, glaucoma specialists, looked at the answer, they couldn't really guess what the patient was talking about. And it was usually like teal, light blue, green, off green, beige, right? So there were a bunch of different descriptors. And I can tell you, I was confused at some of the descriptors. So we're probably not communicating like we think we're communicating. And if you add to it that some of the compounding pharmacies, which I'm an advocate for, I think it can do a lot of good in many cases, but compounding pharmacies don't always follow that rule of cap color to which active ingredient. This is one case which has been rectified, but this is a combo drop that had a yellow top to it, and it wasn't a beta blocker, right? So when latanoprost went generic, a lot of the new generic manufacturers were using a round bottle, and that confused a lot of patients because they were used to the flat bottle that was the branded latanoprost. So little things like that you don't anticipate become a bigger issue. So adherence aids, how many of you know the Travitan dosing aid, upper right-hand corner? A lot of you are younger in this room, so probably never saw it. There's one over there. So when I was a fellow with Rob Noacker, who's at Pittsburgh at the time, he came into clinic and he had this dosing aid, upper right-hand corner again, that Alcon had just put out, and he gave it to me, and he's like, figure this out, right? Go do some stuff with it and figure it out. And this was a device where you would put in the Travitan, and there was a lever on the back where you depress the lever and it would actually deliver a drop. And there was an alarm reminder. That's what the drop is, that digital drop on the front, where it would actually, the alarm would go off and it was time to take your drop. The big problem with it is when the bottle was new and you would put it in, you would push down on the lever, it would actually squirt out the drug. So it wasn't a drop at a time. It was actually like a full squirt that would come out. And so patients were really upset with that part. And then towards the tail end, you wouldn't get anything out. This was supposed to record every time you push down on the lever and say the patient took their drop. They would bring the device in, you would dock it, and there was a docking system with your computer, and you would be able to tell when they used their drops. The problem that I found out sitting in my apartment, as a fellow playing with this thing, my wife thinking I'm crazy, is that you only had to depress halfway down to get it to register that you went halfway down, and a drop might not come out. The opposite would happen where you might not, so sometimes you got it to register and sometimes you didn't, and it was independent of whether the drop came out or not. So this was only on the market for like 24 months, right? They took it off. So it was a good attempt, but it kind of gives you an idea of the barriers that you might not imagine. There was a Lumigan aid that some of you might know that's in the middle there. That was just an alarm. You would put it on the dock and then it would alarm, you would take it off, and of course it doesn't register whether you get the drop in or not. This bottom left-hand corner is one that's actually pretty convenient for a lot of patients. A lot of elderly patients who might not be able to aim or physically might not be able to do. There are several versions of this, by the way. That is relatively helpful. On the bottom right-hand corner, that's one that we use for studies, right? So this is a bottle within a bottle. You take your medication, you put it in the big bottle, you screw it on, and then when it's time to take your drop and you unscrew the top, it registers that you did that. So there's a dosing event that happens. That's only convenient for studies. We don't use it for anything else. So adherence aids have not adequately addressed the human factors. Human factors will always beat anything that we try to do. So where do we go from here? I want to talk about a group of medication approaches, so long-term depots that have either come to market and left or are in study. One that actually just recently made it to market. And I call these gap therapies. These are guided administration of pharmaceuticals that is basically physician controlled, patient independent, physician administered, device guided therapy. This is my wish list. So if you ask me in a perfect world what gap therapy would look like, I would want the patient to have basically nothing to do with it. Physician administered and monitored, where we have full control over how much, when, why, all of that. I want the safety and efficacy profile to be equal to or better than a prostaglandin analog. Long duration of action, if it's non-invasive, like a punctal plug, I'm okay with 3 months. If it's invasive, if it's something that requires an incision, I want it to be at least 24 months. I don't think a year is enough, in my opinion. And it has to be repeatable for the lifetime of the patient because it's a chronic disease. And I want 100% adherence. So I want it to work and deliver drug every time. These are the different categories. Punctal plugs, which have been around for a very long time, for decades. Punctal plugs for drug delivery have been around for over 30 years. Subconjunctival injections, ocular surface inserts like contact lenses or the Helios ring that some of you might be familiar with, and then intraocular depots, which we're hearing a lot more about with the introduction of iDose. So punctal plugs, does anybody know who came up with punctal plugs for drug delivery first time? Some of the more senior doctors in the room. So some of you guys might know Gene Dewan, retina specialist. So he's also the same guy that came up with iris hooks. So he's done a lot of different things. He came up with the first punctal plug that was plausibly able to deliver drug over time. And he sold it to a company called QLT, which tried for a very long time to bring it to market and just wasn't able to. They weren't able to get the fix to the con side of this. So retention was very poor. The majority of plugs during the early phase 2 studies just fell out. It was less effective than timolol. Timolol is a control. And it was also just for a short period of time. They weren't able to load a lot of drug into the punctal plugs. And then there was a regulatory issue from a safety standpoint. The FDA was asking, well, if this plug falls out and the patient doesn't know because it's really small, they might go for therapy, without therapy for a very long time. And for various reasons, punctal plugs just haven't made it to market. Ocular Therapeutics is another company that tried. They succeeded with dexamethasone to bring that to market, but not with the glaucoma drops. Subconjunctival injections, I don't know if any of you were in the anacortev acetate study. Anacortev was used for AMD studies, but also was studied for glaucoma. 100% adherence, you can do this at the slit lamp, patient independent. But this is a picture of one of my patients that I did anacortev. It turned the subconj area completely white, cosmetically unappealing. Patients were not happy with this. You had to put a significant amount of drug underneath the conjunctiva. And again, now you're getting invasive. So you're not just putting a punctal plug in, now you're actually treating the tissue that we rely on for filtration surgery. So if you did multiple sessions of this, you might cause scarring where you can't do a proper trabeculectomy or glaucoma drainage device. Inconsistent delivery, because as was the case with the AMD trials, when you do the injection, a lot of the drug would come back out of that tract, and we couldn't stop that from happening. Frequent re-injections. Historically, this required injection every 3 to 6 months. It wasn't very effective. It caused some scarring and eventually was pulled from the market. So we don't have access to a subconjunctival injection for treatment of glaucoma at this time. This is Helios. This video, I mentioned this at the last talk that I gave. My son walked in the room when I was playing this video, and he's like, "Dad, not cool." Like, what's going on here? This is actually Gene Dewan doing this. And so you can tell because he used a scleral depressor to put this ring in. He's a retina specialist. But this ring is fairly big. It rides in the inferior superior fornix. And what would you guess is a major issue with this from a patient standpoint? Just curious from anybody in the room, but what do you think would be an issue? Let's say this is you getting this. What's that?
Cosmetic.
Cosmetic. So what do you guys think about the cosmetic part of this? Somebody who knows. So when you're talking to the patient, you're seeing this ring. You can still see visibly, you can see it right there. And patients know that. They look in the mirror and they're like very uncomfortable with having this there. They can't go out to dinner and just kind of look somebody in the eye and be okay with it, right? That's a major issue. From a discomfort standpoint, I would say it was a 3 out of 10. I actually put one of these in my own eye. And I was at a meeting and I went around for the rest of the meeting with this. A couple of other guys did it with me. And it was a 3 out of 10, so I could tolerate it, but it was a little bit uncomfortable. And so discomfort is a major issue, and it wasn't as effective as timolol with long-term follow-up. Allergan ended up buying this company, and we haven't heard much about the development since then. It's been multiple years. It was years before the pandemic, so it's been a long time. Intraocular depots. So Durista is something that is on the market, has not gained wide adoption, but there are some surgeons that are doing a significant number of these. I think it's a great solution. On the downside, of course, is the corneal endothelial issues. This made its way into the label. I had 8 patients in the phase 3, and I had a couple of patients who had cornea issues. We made business for our cornea colleagues, right? And the re-injection every 3 to 4 months is an issue. Now, about 25% of the patients who get a single pellet are going to do well for a long period of time beyond that 3 or 4 months, but the majority require re-injection, and the label basically tells you that you should be getting one for the lifetime of that eye. So we only use it for temporizing measure. If somebody has to go to the OR, but they can't go right away, they're not having good adherence, they have allergy to drops, whatever it might be because of the benzalkonium chloride. So it's a very limited pool that we use this in. And the ECL limitation has not been overcome. Some studies have been done to try and overcome that, but we're still sort of limited by that. Although some surgeons are doing multiple injections and saying that they're not having many issues. iDose from Glaukos. Just curious, how many of you have heard of iDose? It's like all over the emails right now, right? So the majority. When I first made this slide, it was before iDose came out, but I have some things in brackets here because I learned a little bit more after it did come out. So 100% adherence. This is put in just like an eye stent, except it has a harpoon, so you're going into the sclera. That's not a marketing term, so don't say harpoon, but there's a fixation portion to it that goes into the sclera. It's repeatable, although the approval is not for repeatable placement. It's really just for one time at this point, but Glaukos is a great company. They're really good at addressing these issues, so I'm sure they're going to get repeatable labels. On the con side, it's invasive. You're going into the eye just like you are with Durista. I talked about timelines, so I wasn't sure when I was looking at the data that we had available before the approval, and I was wondering, are you going to have to go back every year into the operating room, which I think is pretty hard to convince patients to do that. And if you look at the phase 3 data that have been published to date, the approach is non-inferior to timolol up to 3 months. After 3 months, it's no longer inferior to timolol. Timolol is better than the PGA. So that clouds my judgment a little bit on how it's going to be used. Still to be determined. If you look at their phase 2 data, it was a little bit better. For some reason, between phase 2 and phase 3, there were differences between the two. One thing that's coming out now that a lot of my friends are starting to put these in is if you put it in and it's not covered by the lid, the patient sees it when they look in the mirror. So if they're at the mirror and the lights are on, they see the reflection off of the device because it's fairly big. You can see it through the cornea. It's not in the angle itself. It actually projects over the iris body. And so what they're teaching now is to go more superior than nasal so that it's covered by the lid. Most surgeons are on the sidelines of angle surgery, as we said. So even if you are comfortable putting this in, 75% of surgeons who are doing phaco are not going to go to the angle and put something in. Do you guys know what the cost of this is? This is something that made its way into the airways. It's $13,000. Is that, I'm seeing a lot of jaws dropping here. So $13,000 per implant. And I was floored, right? I'm in this business. We have companies that deal with drug delivery. And when I saw $13,000, I was floored. And I don't know what's going to happen with that. But that's a lot of money, right? This is the phase 3 paper that came out. I'm not going to go into too much depth, but what I will say is clearly after 3 months, that non-inferiority is lost, that it doesn't behave the same way after 3 months. As far as medication restarts, you guys have journal clubs, I'm sure, in glaucoma. This is a really good paper. If you're looking for glaucoma papers for journal club, this is a good one. One of the things that they did in the study, and I'm still kind of scratching my head about how they did this, they looked at medication, how many medications the patients were on, and they compared the two groups. The control group was topical timolol. So 100% of the controls were automatically on a drop. Whereas the treatment arm had the travoprost. I should have mentioned that. It's travoprost inside of the canister here. If you were just getting that and a placebo drop, it didn't count against you because you were not on a glaucoma drop. So automatically they're winning on drops. But if you take all comers and you look at how many medications they were on before washout, and then you look at how many drops they were on, active ingredients afterwards, it's about the same. So timolol patients had to go back on some drops, and then the iDose patients had to go on some drops. And so there were failures on both sides for just monotherapy control. It's a really interesting paper when you dig deeper and look at the stats. So if you look at my wish list, I'm not getting everything. I'm getting some of the things, but I'm not getting safety and efficacy profile equal to or better than a PGA at this point. The long duration of efficacy, we're not getting 3 months if it's non-invasive. We're not getting 24 months if it's invasive. So I'm not getting everything that I want, but I really like getting everything that I want. So how can we get there? Patient acceptance is something we don't talk about a lot. We talk about what we want as doctors, but we rarely ask patients what they want when we're developing new products. So we actually did that, and we did it with the same two groups for the previous studies that I was talking about. So this is Jeff Suhu is the lead author. He's one of our glaucoma docs. And in 2016, we did the study where the same patients who were coming out and getting the questionnaires on the cap color, we started asking them questions about what they would accept from a drug delivery standpoint. 45% of patients were accepting of more invasive approaches, which surprised me. So it's not the majority, but it's pretty close. Patients would consider a more invasive approach compared to their topical drops if it had specific advantages. And we explored those advantages with Pradeep's group, and this is what the patient said. So if it obviated added surgery, if it happens at the same time as cataract surgery, then they're all for it. And if it demonstrated greater efficacy than eye drops, then they're all for it. Otherwise, they were sort of on the sidelines of, hey, I'll just use my PGA. I'll be fine with a topical drop, even if I don't use it all the time. So this was really good information for me to see that patients understood that if there was something that would be better from an adherence standpoint that gave these value propositions, they'd be all for it. One of the reasons is that I think the majority of patients know that their drops don't get in. I think patients inherently know that they have a hard time getting this in. I did this study with Gabo Lascano, who's a glaucoma specialist in Puebla, Mexico. And we brought in a bunch of patients and we videotaped them putting in their drops. And we did educational sessions to see if we can improve how they instill the drops, right? So can we actually get them to do the installation better? We looked at number of drops instilled, number of drops reaching the ocular surface, and then number of times the tip of the bottle touched something it wasn't supposed to touch. And this is one of the patients. She was okay with us showing this video. We said, put the drop in your left eye, and she was still confused. Do I put it in the right? And you can see she's rubbing on the eyelid. We counted about 7 drops. She's actually squeezing a stream in there, if you notice that. And she wasn't sure at this point. What she said is she wasn't sure if a drop came out, right? So we did a 30-minute educational session. And you can see she's trying to pivot over the other hand, which is really good, but she doesn't quite get there. The 2 hands are not touching, and she's still touching the eye. She's still touching the cornea. And this is a patient who has drops that she's taking for glaucoma, by the way. So this is what's happening at home, and we're just not seeing this part. And very, very telling study for us. We did get a little bit better after educating. The number of drops instilled went down from 1.5 to 1.2 on average. The number of drops reaching the eye from 0.9 to 1. Number of times touching the eye, you can still see it went down, but it was significant. And then proper installation improved to 82% from 66%. Common question that I get is what happens if you go back 3 months later, right? Does the education actually wear off? And it does. We just haven't followed it up with another paper. But patients forget, they don't do the same stuff, and they go back to their baseline. This is the human factors thing that I was talking about. So the study conclusion at the bottom here is the most important. Many, likely most patients, just can't use drops appropriately. When I show the videos and there's a lot of oohing and ahhing and laughter, which wasn't the case here, which is great, but when I say that, I just usually say out loud, if you think it's funny, just go get an artificial tear and then have your spouse, videotape you doing it. We do exactly the same thing as ophthalmologists. It's just really hard to put drops in appropriately. All right, so we're going to talk at the end here just 2 technologies, and then we'll take a break for 15, 20 minutes, I think is what I heard. Yeah. So first technology is called CU lacrimal system drug delivery device. If any of you are marketers, you can think of a better name for it. So that's not it. And what I was thinking, I did a lot of work early on in my career with punctal plugs. And I thought, okay, is there a better way to do it? The punctum itself is a really nice natural place where you can put a reservoir to deliver drugs for a period of time. How amazing would it be if we can go and do our outreach visits and just put punctal plugs in everybody that will deliver for an extended period of time? I think that would be amazing. but there have been limitations in the past. And these limitations are what I discussed before, that fallout, not enough delivery, not as effective as timolol. And we tried to address this by a different form factor. So you see a plug on the left-hand side. It's more of a canalicular plug, not just into the punctum. And the way that this works is there are 2 lumens in the device leading to a reservoir balloon at the end of the device. One of the holes on the faceplate has a hydrogel in it that limits the egress of fluid. And the other hole is to inject medication into the reservoir balloon. I'll show an animation, it'll make more sense. And then that is fully plugged. So the drug can only exit through one of the holes at the faceplate and deliver drug directly to the tear film. And so it addresses a lot of the issues because these things are not falling out, and you'll see why when you see the animation. And it's an active delivery. So as the balloon is collapsing, it's delivering drug to the faceplate. You don't have to depend on tears getting into the device and kind of coming out of the device with drug. And so this is what it looks like. You can do this at the slit lamp. This is how we've been doing it. And the device goes in. The balloon, of course, is collapsed at the time it goes in to the nasolacrimal sac. There's enough space around this tube so that tears can get around it. The balloon then inflates, and you can store about 6 months of therapy for glaucoma in this reservoir. The nasolacrimal sac is much bigger than you would imagine. A lot of you who have done oculoplastics rotations, you know that that space is considerable. But it took a lot of testing to get to the point where we could put these in patients. We had to make sure that there was no leakage from the balloon. So this is just fluorescein sitting in the balloons, making sure that there's no leakage from it, and we didn't find any. We also were able to use this to measure how much drug is coming out over time to tailor the hydrogel to the specific therapy. So if we wanted anti-allergy medication, we could put a different hydrogel in it. If we wanted glaucoma therapy, we could have the glaucoma hydrogel going into it. And we took this into our initial patients, and we implanted devices bilaterally. And the patients were comfortable. They actually didn't even know that there was an inflated balloon, and that, well, of course we told them, but they couldn't feel it. And we thought this was good proof of concept to take it to the next level. At this stage, when comparing it to the different depots that have been put into either the punctum or other depots, what I'm most excited about is that this is clearly an office procedure. It can happen at the slit lamp. It can be done by various healthcare professionals, and it's something that you can teach relatively easily to get this done anywhere really around the world. At this stage, we have a partnership with Zeiss for the development of the device, and we're just now starting that development next stage as a team between the University of Colorado and Zeiss, FCI, which is one of the arms of Zeiss. All right, here's the last part of this. And how many of you have heard of Spyglass? Anybody? Just curious. Yeah, so we've been 5 years into this, and we just haven't talked about it this much. We're just now starting to talk about Spyglass. So 20% of cataract surgeries are done in eyes that also have glaucoma or ocular hypertension. This is the MIGS category that is being touted with iStent and other devices. Low friction for patients and surgeons to take care of their glaucoma at the time of cataract surgery. Patients are usually very happy to have that done. So what is the Spyglass platform? We use a hydrophobic acrylic lens, C-loop haptics, with a slight modification at the haptic-optic junction. The 2 drug dispensers ride over the haptic-optic junction, and then everything else from this point forward is very similar to standard cataract surgery. So off-the-shelf injector, 2.4 millimeter incision, goes into the capsular bag, and it delivers bimatoprost for a period of 3 years. You can see the animation of drug, that's drug delivering. We spent about 3 years of work making sure that it did exactly what I just said. In multiple animal models, we validated this both in vitro and in vivo. And we're very excited about taking this into patients. And we just went into our first in-human study a couple of years ago. And we went in with 3 different doses that were tailored around what Durista delivers per day, except we had a depot for 3 years. And we enrolled 23 eyes of 23 patients. Post-washout, these were mild to moderate glaucoma patients. And we are just now starting to release our data. You can see here that with 1 year of follow-up to date that's public, we have subsequent follow-ups that we haven't released yet. We'll release them in coming months. 45% mean IOP reduction and all the patients remain off of all of their topical medications. So super excited about this. I haven't seen something like this in any other study. No device-related adverse events to date. And a couple of things that you don't see from just looking at this graph. At 12 months, all the patients were below 18 millimeters of mercury. So there weren't a lot of patients that were kind of above and below that, that threshold of 18 that we like to see. And from a vision standpoint with the lens, all of the patients were at the FDA threshold or better of 20/40 or better. The majority of these patients were 20/20 and basically functioning as any IOL that you might use in a cataract patient. The SpyGlass platform can accommodate different drugs. We can not just do glaucoma drops, but also post-operative drops. So if you wanted to do dropless cataract surgery, dexamethasone, NSAID. There are other glaucoma therapeutics. Also looking at chronic uveitis for multiple years. We can deliver up to 8 years with these dispensers, so it's long-term delivery. And then we also have a project looking at AMD for wet AMD therapy. There's also a second-generation device, which isn't public, which allows us to replenish the therapy every 3 years. Some of you might know these team players. I always like to mention the people who are working on this just because they're working really hard. Patrick Mooney, who I talked about during lunch today. So Patrick used to be my district manager when I was a resident. We got in a huge fight and then became really close friends. When it was time to hire a CEO, he was leading Novartis Ophthalmology in the US. So we recruited him from Novartis. He's now CEO. Glenn Sussman, do you guys, did anybody use Aqualase once upon a time from Alcon? It was hot water that was used to remove cataracts instead of ultrasound. Glenn Sussman, he'll be happy to know that nobody's ever heard of it, but he's the guy who worked on it. Long-term Alcon employee. He came into Claire Vista, which is a company I'll talk about in a later talk, and then rolled in from Claire Vista into SpyGlass, and he's been instrumental. He's the co-founder of the company with me. Margot Goodkin, glaucoma specialist, trained at Bascom. She was at the FDA for a long time, went into Allergan, and then she just joined us as CMO. And then James Denwell, who he has his MBA, but he acts like an engineer. He can do a lot of different things. It's really exciting to have this group. There are about 30 members in SpyGlass right now. We submitted our IND. We're in the middle of our phase 1/2, and we're just now meeting with the FDA to start talking about what the phase 3 will look like. So stay tuned for that. These are a couple of points that I think are really important. SpyGlass drug delivery is a different way of looking at lenses. Potential for longest duration of delivery compared to other sustained drug delivery platforms that are either on the market or that were studied in the past. It delivers from the safety of the capsular bag, so no risk of injury to the corneal endothelium. Established regulatory and reimbursement pathways. We already know what's required because it's already been clearly described by the FDA. And it's accessible to all cataract surgeons. So the 75% of cataract surgeons that are on the sidelines, we can now get them into treating glaucoma at the time of cataract surgery. So I'll close off with this slide. We went back to ChatGPT, and we put the rest of the transcript in after going through this talk a few times. And the one point that I just want to make here is the summary of this talk. These points got thrown in without me actually mentioning it, that clinicians, researchers, regulatory experts, industry members, and investors, basically the whole ecosystem has to get around in order to do this. I think if I came back next year to give a talk, ChatGPT is just going to give the talk for me, right? And I think the really important point here is that the promise is now reality, that a lot of the things that we were looking for in the wish list, I think we're pretty close to getting there. We'll see how the phase 3 goes, but pretty excited about how things are going to date. So I'll stop there, and it might be good to take a break. I think everybody's ready for a break. So how about 15, 20-minute break? What time is it right now? So 3:19, do you want to come back at 3:40? Is that good? All right, 3:40. All right, thanks.